This workshop is part of the Zero to Mastery Academy. You can watch the full workshop and all previously held workshops by joining the Zero to Mastery Academy. Click the link in the video description below to check it out.
This is a workshop on preparing to prepare for the FAANG interview. So I want to give you a little bit of an idea about what to expect throughout this workshop. So this workshop aims to give you a good high-level idea of what you need to know and what mentality you ought to have going into your prep. So this isn't necessarily the prep itself, but it gives you an idea of what you ought to expect for these interviews, as well as your preparation plan to start getting ready for these interviews, because these interviews are extremely difficult and they're notorious for being very difficult. Throughout this workshop, we are going to cover a lot of these topics that will help bring all of this together so you have a good idea of what you're walking into, because there is going to be a lot expected from you if you're going to prepare for these companies. So to start, let's begin with who I am. So I'm Yihua Zhang. I have a bachelor's of philosophy and political science. Before this, I was an LSAT tutor, a personal trainer, and then I became a software developer before becoming a Zero to Mastery instructor here. In this process, I have worked as a software engineer for a couple of years before. I was a developer for the majority of that time. In total, I have 6 years of experience in this industry, working for many of the top tech companies in Toronto, as well as some of the companies in San Francisco. So one of the things that I do want to mention, as I mentioned earlier, is that this is a topic that I hold very dear and near to my heart because I spent so long, the last entire year, preparing for my interviews here. So my significant other is actually in San Francisco. She works at Twitch as a UX designer. So for me, being a Toronto and a Canadian citizen, I wanted to come to San Francisco to be with her and as well absorb kind of this whole software engineering culture. So I prepared, I did numerous interviews, and I actually got numerous offers from these big FAANG companies. However, you'll notice in my section here that I do not have a computer science degree. So I do not want to say that this is a deterrent for anybody to apply for these companies, because these FAANG companies have offices everywhere in the world. But currently, in the current administration, it's very difficult. I'd say impossible to get a working visa without a computer science degree or a relevant degree. This does not mean that this is the case for other countries, but it's just that under the current administration, this is a challenge for anyone that is not a US citizen to get a working visa in an engineering role. So this is one thing that I do want to mention for you when you're considering this option for yourself. We all know that these FAANG companies pay enormous salaries, and it's the most enormous at San Francisco. It's so high, in fact, that high-ranking engineers can make over 500,000 USD as their salary, including all of your benefits, such as the stock options, right? The stock options probably take up actually 50% when you're at that high of a position. But even then, at these FAANG companies, these options are pretty much as good as cash because they're so publicly traded and they're probably the most expensive stocks on the market. So this is just a little bit of background for you. I did get offers as well in Canada for some of these FAANG companies and FAANG-like companies. But of course, the goal being that I come to San Francisco. This is one of the reasons why I'm kind of just waiting to see how this administration plays out in November. But this is just some details as well. For some of you, you may notice that it's actually more difficult right now due to the coronavirus situation. They've just made it very difficult for anybody to kind of move borders, and a lot of companies are taking more considerations due to government pressure when it comes to issuing out these working visas to anybody that is foreign to US soil. So that's one of the kind of not fun logistical sides of this thing, but this is still very good because once again, this is just the current state right now. Things will change, and these companies are constantly pushing to try and get foreign talent into the country. So if you are a national, a US national, then this is perfectly fine. This is nothing to do with you, and you can easily go through this workshop, go through your prep, and get a job. If you're not, this is just one of those additional things you want to consider unless you're applying for your own or one of these FAANG offices in your own country. So that's one of the big things that I do want to mention and get out of the way. So moving forward, let's talk about what the itinerary for this will be. So for this workshop, we're going to cover 4 main topics. We're going to cover what the interview process at FAANG is, what are the technical interviews, what are the 3 keys to succeed in your interviews, and then how to plan for your interview prep. So these are the 4 main sections that we're going to cover throughout this workshop. So to start, the first thing we want to talk about is what is the interview process at FAANG. So when we start thinking about the interview process at FAANG, we got to break down this FAANG acronym. FAANG stands for Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. It is a basket of the most lucrative tech companies in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley. When we talk about FAANG, though, we're talking about not just these 5 companies. Of course, they stand at the very top, but it also represents FAANG-like companies. FAANG-like companies are all of these tech-first companies that you see that hold the same level of stringency when it comes to the actual technical interview itself. What this means is that they are tech companies that are probably worth billions of dollars on the stock market in terms of the company's total valuation, but also that they got there through a lot of scaling, writing software that is very scaled. So they probably have hundreds of millions of users making hundreds of millions of requests every day. And they're working with massive, massive data sets. So all of these companies care about an engineering-esque interview. And the engineering-esque interview is what we're going to be preparing ourselves for throughout the rest of this prep to even interview for these companies. I do want to mention that these interviews are going to be unlike any interview you've done unless you yourself had interviewed for these companies before. Whenever I say FAANG, I mean this whole basket of these software engineering type interviews. So that's one thing that I do want to make very clear. When we talk about how you get these jobs, there's 2 things. You can apply for these companies just like any other job. So when you apply for these companies, if you've taken my first workshop, you'll understand some of the tips and tricks I give you about how to improve your resume, how to properly set up your portfolio, your GitHub, all of that stuff. For these interviews, it's actually not as prevalent. I'm going to be honest. Cold applications maybe only make it through 3 to 4% of the time. This actually changes as well, depending on what level you're applying for in terms of the seniority of the role. So if you are just cold applying, you can definitely try and do so. And you just got to understand that if you get rejected, it's nothing on you. It's just the way that they're really stringent on how they pull people into the company. And the reason for this, we're going to go a little bit later. But cold applications and all of the techniques that you can do as you've learned in the first workshop, which you can find, of course, in your Zero to Mastery dashboard if you want to look. All of these things are not as applicable. So that's one thing you do want to keep in mind. The reason for this is because referrals drive the majority of the hiring decisions at these companies. The only way that they can vet whether or not you are a viable candidate is if somebody in the company has worked with you before. And even then, at companies like Google, they want to know that you are within the top 10% of people that person that's referring you has worked with. This will be part of the questionnaire they give. Even if you get a referral from somebody and they're like, you know what, I've worked with him in the same company, but I didn't really know him. Chances are you're a little bit higher than a cold applicant, but they're still not going to prioritize you. There's multiple of these kind of filters that they source candidates into when they're thinking about applicants. The only time where this application process changes is if you're a student. If you're a computer science student going for an internship, or you're a returning intern, let's say like Justin, for example, who had an internship and then he came in. This is where it changes, because when they're hiring for junior roles, like L3 roles, they are much more open to these type of cold applications from students, as long as your grades matter and your, the projects that you've done, all of those things get factored in. But generally speaking, referrals is going to be your main driver. But this is not to say that you should not do cold applications if you don't have any referrals. This is just something that you need to keep in mind as far as your actual success rate when it comes to getting these interviews. This does decrease, though. I will mention that your cold application does increase the the further you get from the FAANG companies. So Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, they are the big companies in this acronym because they have the most demand. So they need to sift out the most number of applicants as possible. So if you're talking about like the smaller, but still very, very successful and very, very good companies to work for, like Uber, like Stripe, like Snapchat, these companies, they may be more preferable to a cold application. So generally speaking, the idea is that you can always work your way up, because even if you don't have any of these referrals, if you've worked at a big tech company like these ones that I'm talking about, your application is still going to be much more favored. It gets treated as a much higher caliber because somebody in the valley or within these big tech companies has vetted you already. So that's kind of a process of getting in. And we'll talk more about this later as well when we talk about planning for your interview prep process. But these are some big things that you need to keep in mind. So let's talk about getting the actual interview. Let's say you've actually gotten the interview and this is you. You've applied for the 5 big FAANG tech companies. Now, let's say Google responds well. You get an offer, or not an offer, but they take in your resume and they want to proceed through the interview process for you. So here what's going to happen is that they are going to send you a recruiter. So this is not the type of recruiter you might have worked with before. This is an internal recruiter, somebody that works in the company, generally speaking. What's going to happen is that they are going to give you your first interview, and this is known as the gut check interview. The gut check interview is just a quick 15 to 30-minute phone call where they will verify that you are who you are. And also, they need to make sure that there's no immediate red flags for them not to proceed further down this process. So when I talk about this gut check interview, most of the questions they're going to ask you is a little bit about what you did before. Generally, they're going to ask, why are you interested in working at our company? So for example, if you get a Facebook gut check interview, why would you want to work at Facebook? And they want to hear things like, you almost have to prove everything that you feel about wanting to work at these FAANG companies. You need to be able to articulate to them. So that's the most important thing. If you seem like you're not really that interested, then that's a red flag, of course. So obviously most people aren't going to be that way, but this is just for them to skim out a lot of the candidates that don't seem that interested or maybe aren't true engineers. The other thing they're probably going to ask you is, how much time do you spend coding every day? This is an important question for them because they honestly want to prioritize people that live and breathe coding. This is a good way for them to see whether or not you're really committed to the craft of coding, because they're looking for the best engineers in the world, or at the very least, they're trying to get them. Whether or not they're able to do so through this interview process is another thing, but that's their main priority. So if they ask that question, you want to emphasize that you code as much as you can. You spend as much of your time trying to improve as an engineer, thinking about different ways to improve your coding principles, working with good people, building side projects. You just want to articulate that you spend a lot of time, if not all your time, coding. That is the best way for you to get through this gut check. So once you're through the gut check, which is the easiest interview to get through, the recruiter will then set you up for a call with an engineer. This is going to be your first interview. And this technical engineer will give you a technical phone screen. So this is going to be another call. This can happen through a video chat service like Skype or Google Meet, Google Hangouts, or maybe even a local service. And usually what's going to happen is you are going to be given 1 hour interview on this technical phone screen, and you're going to be given 1 to 2 technical problems. These technical problems are not the technical problems that you work on in your day-to-day. I want to stress that, Because if you are right now working as a developer that is not at one of these large companies, chances are you have never seen these technical problems before. If you have a computer science degree, then you'll understand the basis of some of these questions, which is based on data structures and algorithms, which we'll go into later in this workshop. But generally speaking, most developers have never seen anything related to these technical problems before. So we're going to spend some time in this workshop breaking down what these types of problems are and how you can actually prepare for them, because this is one of the very unfortunate things about this interview process, is that these technical problems are, a lot of people complain. A lot of people think it's unfair. Why am I being asked these questions that I never do as a developer? Even working in this company, you may not encounter these problems in, I want to say maybe like 50, 60% of the roles that you do, because the companies are massive and there's many different roles. They may hire you as a software engineer, but you may not be tasked in a project that requires you to work with some of the challenges that come up in these technical problems. However, once again, these companies are working with data at massive scale. So they want to know that if there's a chance that I give you something related to what these technical problems will highlight, which is scalability, then I want to know that you're at least familiar enough with it. Now, is it so familiar with the extent of how much you need to study? Probably not. But once again, this is a process in which they need to filter down the pool of candidates, which we'll talk about. So this is one thing. This technical phone screen is actually part of what you're going to prep for. For the second interview in your interview process is already going to test how well you've prepared for these interviews. So this is one thing I do want to mention up front, because if your thought process is that you should apply for these interviews and then go through some of these steps and then prepare after, it may already be too late. You need to realize how early on these technical interviews are in terms of potentially blindsiding you with where you need to start preparing for the actual questions you're going to be asked to solve. If you do well and you pass these technical problems, what's going to happen is that they will then invite you to an on-site interview. Now, given the Corona situation, this is probably going to be just a whole day of technical phone screen interviews. So it's kind of like 5 of those previous ones we just saw. But if you do get invited into their local headquarters for you to do your interview, wherever you're applying, what's going to happen is they will pay for your flight and your hotel. If you're applying, for example, for the San Francisco office, they will fly you in, give you a hotel and some compensation for meals for that day. But if you're working, you will have to take work off in order to do these interviews, because it's a whole day interview. So this is 5 interviews for the whole day, 1 hour each. 5 different technical engineers, generally speaking. 4 of them are technical interviews. So they are repeats of what we saw, where we're doing the technical problems. And 1 of them is going to be a personality and culture fit interview. This generally follows the same structure. It may vary from company to company in terms of whether or not you get a personality culture fit interview. You might even get 2 at some of the smaller tech companies. Some of the big companies, if you're applying for a really senior role, one of the technical interviews might not be a technical problem. It might be a system design problem. In fact, the more senior you go, the more emphasis there is on system design. System design is a topic we're not going to cover throughout this workshop, because most people who are going for these interviews at that caliber, at that level of seniority, you will have to prepare for your system design. So like, for example, I had to do a couple, but it's not really that important at this current stage of what we're talking about. If there are people that are interested in system design, I'll talk a little bit about it near the end in the Q&A section, but generally we're not going to talk about system design, because if you're applying for like L3, L4, you're not going to see a system design interview. But here, when we talk about these personality culture fit interview, this is also not a breeze interview. This interview varies on the company. Google will test you on what they call your Googliness. So this is where they're looking for your personality to show leadership characteristics, to see if you work well with people, if you have good conflict resolution. Google is looking to hire the best engineers that are not just intelligent when it comes to building software, but intelligent when it comes to working with people. So here, if you come from a different discipline, this is actually where you might shine because you're able to demonstrate that you've worked with a lot of different people in different capacities before, which stereotypically engineers don't really get that much exposure to. I don't want to use stereotypes, but this is generally a good place where I've seen candidates shine when they are able to demonstrate that they have experience outside of just being your typical engineer per se. So this is one thing to mention. Amazon, for example, will test you on their key leadership principles. This is something that you can easily Google and see what they are. So this is the on-site interview, and the technical problems here in the 4 to 5 technical rounds you will get are going to be even more difficult. So that's something that you want to keep in mind, is that it will be harder, generally speaking, than the technical phone screen. And in all of these technical interviews, you probably will not be working with your preferred IDE. Your IDE in this case is something like your VS Code or your Atom, or even Webflow, or not Webflow. I can't remember the name of that one. But there's just, generally speaking, you're going to be working in something that's very rudimentary as far as your coding goes. They might even ask you to whiteboard your code. So this is why I do want to mention as well, when you're preparing, prepare in the environment that you're going to do. I bought a whiteboard and I did all of my coding on my whiteboard. Throughout this workshop, when I do show you some instances of what we're going to talk about, I'm going to do it on an iPad just to show you what the process is like when you're thinking it out. And we'll talk about that more extensively as to why this is the process. But just understand that this is another thing in your prep that you have to consider. And we'll go over all of this again later in the workshop. So if you pass your on-sites, you do well in all 5 of your interviews, because generally speaking, if you're going for the big 5 FAANG companies, they want you to excel in all 5, which is where they're able to determine whether or not, you're what they call a false positive. So that's just like kind of like a candidate maybe got lucky in a couple interviews, but then they did poorly on one. Well, it's like, how poorly did they do? Is it such a case that we just don't want to take that chance? Like, why would they fail in that one interview? This is one of the things. So it's actually a lot about consistency as well. So I've talked a lot about this mysterious technical interview. What is this technical interview? Okay, so let's break this down. To start, we need to understand what the purpose of the technical interview is. I mentioned it a little bit already, but here, these companies, everybody dreams to get a job at the FAANG or FAANG-like company. They get hundreds of thousands of applications per year, which is incredibly large for their HR team to sift through. So they need to figure out an efficient way for them to filter this number down to the hundreds of roles that they need to fill per year. This means that we're looking at a 99% decrease in the overall number of applicants coming into the final positions that get filled. And this is not meant to sound scary, but it's just how it is. These are the top institutions in the world that build the best software with the best people that are looking to solve the most challenging problems. They're worth the most amount of money and they pay the highest. They are absolutely the cream of the crop. And if you want to work here, there's a reason you want to work here. There's a reason why every developer and engineer comes in and thinks, oh, Google's an amazing place. I want to work there one day. Everyone has the same idea. So for this reason, there's this many applicants. They need to filter all this down to the best possible candidates. Now, is this process the best way they can do so? Probably not, but it's the most efficient way they can do so with the resources that the HR teams have. So this is part of the consideration as to why the interview process is this way. I do want to mention that while this interview process seems very intimidating, this is one of the ways that they can also bring in candidates that do not come from a traditionally technical background. For them to bring in candidates that have no degree in computer science, if you're able to prove that you know the topics that a computer science grad would have, and you're able to apply them even better than a computer science grad, then of course they will hire you, because learning these topics is very difficult. You can akin this to any kind of standardized test in a lot of these different positions in other job positions. Like to become a lawyer, you have to pass the LSAT, which is also a very rigorous standardized test, but it's all logical games in the LSAT, but lawyers don't do logical games, in fact. They mostly comb through hundreds and hundreds of case files trying to look for patterns and similarities that they can use to build a case. It has nothing to do with the LSAT, but once again, it's a filtering process. They're trying to figure out a couple things, which is one, is this candidate really good at working hard? At the very least, can we guarantee that this person works hard and figures out this topic? So this is part of the purpose of why this technical interview is this way. The other side of the coin is that this special type of technical question uncovers a couple things. The first is whether or not the candidate knows the best practices. Because you're writing code and you're thinking about how you're breaking apart a technical problem. Here, you are essentially being tested on your ability to write well-written, scalable code according to the best practices as a developer. This is where your overlap in your experience as a developer does play a role. So this is about writing good modular code, right? We're writing dry code. We're writing or thinking about our code in a way which is very single responsibility. We're following solid foundations, all of the things that you've learned throughout all of the courses on this academy. These are all of the things that will apply in this section on best practices. So this is where you're writing your code according to, again, these best practices. Now, the other thing, though, is that your code is scalable. This scalability is a huge factor for them because scalability determines how fast a receiving user that's using this software is able to get the things that they need from the application. If you think about Google search always tells you how fast they were able to deliver you billions to trillions of results in milliseconds. This is because the code that they've written is extremely, extremely scalable. So that is how they're able to guarantee that. And that's how you as a user are able to get that experience because they have written code. They're engineers that built their search engine, that built the database and how they properly indexed everything. All of that stuff is extremely scalable. It's the most scalable you can possibly get that code. That's what they care about through these technical interviews, through these technical questions. They're trying to see whether or not you're able to write this scalable solution. And this is going to be the majority of what we're going to focus on. The best practices we'll cover as we do some of the actual questions. But when we talk about the actual topic itself, scalability here is the most important thing to think about. The way that you capture this scalability is through the knowledge of data structures and algorithms. Data structures and algorithms, if you've taken Andre's Mastering the Coding interview, or if you have a computer science degree, you'll know what these are. If you don't worry, I'm going to give you a really quick rundown of what they are. They're actually not as intimidating as it sounds. As far as the concept goes, there's just a lot of them, which is what makes it actually complex. But let's start with data structures. What are data structures? Well, let me give you an analogy or a metaphor to begin with. Let's say you have physical files, like paper files, and you want to store your paper files. You can store them in a cabinet, and a cabinet has certain benefits, right? It can't be moved. It's in a physical location, or at least it's very difficult to move, but you have a lot of space, and it's very easy for you to organize a cabinet in many different ways for your files. You can organize it alphabetically. You can organize it by date. There's many different ways that you can organize files using a cabinet. So storing a cabinet comes with those benefits. You can store it in a backpack. In a backpack, you don't really have a lot of space, so you may not have that much organization, but it's extremely mobile. You can put your files in your backpack. You can take it from your office to your home, no problem. Or you can store it in a folder. A folder lends itself to some more organization than a backpack because you're able to label the folder. Multiple folders together can categorize different topics. And a folder is pretty mobile. It's much more mobile than a cabinet, but it's not as protective in terms of its mobility as a backpack. These are all different kind of devices or different storage things that you can use to store files, and they all have their different trade-offs. A data structure is the exact same thing, except instead of files, you're storing data. So for example, you've probably worked with arrays before. Arrays is a linear data structure, meaning that it is a single 2D plan, or sorry, one-dimensional line of data, right? Whether you're holding numbers, whether you're holding strings, whether you're holding objects, other arrays, whatever it is, an array is a data structure that has certain rules to it that you can utilize in order to store your information. There are also trees. Most developers will have never seen a tree before, but a tree is another data structure that comes with different trade-offs you can have when it comes to storing data. There are also graphs. There are also matrices. There are also singly and doubly linked lists, and there's many more other data structures. All of these data structures are just a different way that you can store and access data, whether more efficiently or with a specific purpose. That's all data structures are. When it comes to learning data structures is what gives you a big boost in your performance when it comes to actually working with data. And these companies, in order to make sure that you know how to write scalable code, want to make sure that you're using the correct data structure for the problem at hand. So this is why data structures are a key part of this interview process. The next thing then is algorithms. What are algorithms? If you've done math before, then algorithms is something that's more familiar to you. If you haven't, it's very simple. In the context of computer science, it is a block of code that solves a problem. You've actually written numerous algorithms before as a developer. Here, you can imagine that an algorithm is kind of like just a function per se. It's a function that takes an input and it returns an output. Ideally, this is also a pure function so that there's no real side effects. What this means is that, let's say we have an algorithm that multiplies numbers. What it does is it takes two numbers, you pass it into the input, so as the arguments of your function, and you get back an output. In this case, it multiplies the two numbers together. 9 by 4 gives us 36. You can do this with any number of numbers. You can pass it 11 and 12, right? This gives you 132. You can pass it 228 and 94. This gives you 21,432. Whatever numbers you pass to this multiply numbers algorithm, it just multiplies them together for you. It solves the problem of multiplying two numbers. This is a very simple case of an algorithm. You can think of a more complex example where, let's say it's a find number algorithm. You give it a bunch of different numbers and you give it the number that you want it to find within all of these numbers. So let's say we get those numbers and we want to find 4. What it will do is it will return to you all of the places where there is 4 in the larger number. You can get really complex with an algorithm that solves Sudoku. So for example, you pass it an unfinished Sudoku problem, and what it will do is it will actually solve it for you and return you a valid solution, a valid Sudoku solved puzzle. These are all examples of algorithms, and this is what you are going to be writing. You are going to be given a very constrained problem with very specific inputs, or a range of inputs, but the inputs themselves are very tight in terms of what you should expect them to be. Here, you will have to use these inputs and solve a specific problem, which is what the technical problems are. This might be something like solving Sudoku. This is a great example. You're going to be given an unfinished Sudoku puzzle. You will then have to figure out and write an algorithm that will efficiently solve this problem. So that's what you're going to be doing with the algorithms part. There are also many other algorithms that other developers and computer software engineers, computer science academics have created. You will have to learn them and figure out how to implement them in your own algorithms so that you can create more efficient solutions. These are all the different things that you will be encompassed to learn when it comes to data structures and algorithms. Let's talk about what these questions kind of look like. So this is an example of one of the questions that you will be tasked to do potentially. So I do want to mention that there is a wide berth of what these questions could be. They're pretty set in stone in the sense that if you're able to solve the majority of these questions, any new questions that they come up with, you can probably also solve. And this question in particular is one that we will be working through in terms of the full process of understanding what it is that we will be preparing ourselves to do. So this question is, given an unsorted array, return the kth largest element. It is the kth largest element in sorted order of the array, not the kth distinct element. So here, when we get this question, chances are we've never seen this type of question before. And we might even right now be thinking in our heads of a way to solve it. Maybe we're also confused about some of the terminology, but let's walk through it and understand some of the process of what it means to solve a question like this. And I just want to give you a taste, and I want you to get your mind set in the kind of way you should be thinking about how to approach these technical problems when you even begin preparing to solve and to study to solve these technical problems. So the first thing you need to understand is that based on this question, it's already telling you what type of input you're going to be given. In this case, you know your input is going to be an unsorted array. What is in that array? It doesn't matter. Your solution needs to account for any possible type of unsorted array in this particular case, and your solution needs to return the kth largest element in that unsorted array. This kth is also something you're going to get. Kth here is going to be another number. This number is going to indicate what number largest element in this unsorted array you're looking for. So here, when we think about it, as I mentioned, let's say we get k equals 2. And let's say we receive an array. The array has 5, 3, 1, 6, 4, 2. We want the second largest number because k equals 2. So what we want to do is we want to figure out a way to sort this array and then figure out from the very end the second last number, because that will be the second largest number. This is logically how you would think about what the kth largest number of an unsorted array is. How you actually solve this problem, you might have all these different ideas about, which is good because you want to at least have the kind of mentality about thinking of trying to solve the problem versus being intimidated and scared of the question, which is also a very normal response to seeing these questions for the first time. But you want to really think about how you can break down this problem first. And the way that we can break this down is we need to understand those technical topics, and we need to understand the data structures and the algorithms first, because there's a lot of unpacking we have to do for a question like this in order to even understand whether or not we're even approaching the problem correctly. And this is going to set you up for the mindset I want you to build as you do begin preparing for your interviews. This is just giving you a streamlined perspective. So let's say I give you a massive array of numbers. Any ideas that you may have had about how to logically solve that problem might go entirely out the window just by the fact that this massive array of numbers becomes extremely difficult for you to navigate, right? It's very hard to even think about how you would parse this thing. Like, what are you figuring out? How do you get your solution properly? And here is where the challenge of scalability arises. The main thing of why they leave this open-ended in terms of what type of unsorted array you're going to get is because they want to make sure that your solution accounts for a massive, massive unsorted array. So here is where you need to combine all of these data structures and algorithm topics together in order to come up with a scalable solution. So before we actually dive into that, I want to set you up with the 3 keys of technical interviews. And through this process is how we're actually going to get a good idea of what kind of data structures and algorithms are going to be incorporated and how are they useful for a question like this. So here, there are 3 different keys. The first being the technical knowledge. This is the best practices of coding. This is the data structures. This is the algorithms. The second is your critical and abstract problem solving. So when we talk about your critical and abstract problem solving, just having knowledge of data structures and algorithms is not enough at all to solve this problem. A lot of these problems come off similar to almost like a brain puzzle. It's like a riddle. And this is one of those things where you need to figure out how to work your brain in a way that is specific for solving these problems. So that's one of the very key things we need to work on when we're doing our prep. It's not enough to memorize solutions. It's not enough to know the data structures and the algorithms. It's about how to critically and abstractly solve problems in this space, utilizing the technical knowledge. And this seems kind of vague, but we'll go a little bit more in depth as to what this problem solving process is going to look like. The third key is communication. In this live interview, you will be in a very stressful situation with another engineer. This engineer has a very personality. You don't know what type of engineer they're going to have. You don't know whether this person had a bad week. You don't know if this person is coming off from a bad day. You don't know if this person is going to be the nicest person you've ever met. All of these are wild card factors that are going to influence your ability to perform and solve a already extremely difficult and intimidating technical question during the interview. This is where making sure that you're able to properly communicate with this individual and properly calm yourself down by treating this person like another human being and another engineer. And also demonstrate that you yourself are also a good communicating engineer. This is going to help you in actually succeeding in this interview. You want to talk out your solutions. You want to constantly talk about what you're thinking about. You want to talk through your process. These are all very important pieces when it comes to actually succeeding in this interview. Because if you have the right idea in your head, but you make mistakes when you're writing it down or when you're coding it out, and this engineer doesn't know what you're doing, they will absolutely just be like, this person doesn't know. You might have the right idea. You might even have the right solution in your head. But if you're not communicating and if you're not properly nailing down exactly what it is that you need to articulate in your problem-solving process, then this person, you're just doing yourself no favors. This person is going to write you off. So this is one of the most important things. So these are the 3 keys that you want to work on while you're solving problems and preparing for these technical interviews. You need to work on your technical knowledge, of course. You got to build your data structures. You got to build your algorithms. You got to build your coding practices, and you need to incorporate them all into your practice of doing technical problems. And throughout this process, you need to work on your problem solving process. Then you need to be communicating, even if it's with yourself. You just want to make sure that every step you do, you're just talking out loud. You're just constantly articulating what's in your mind. You're essentially reworking your brain in a way that's tailored to acing this interview, because it's a test. That's really all it is. So you're just manipulating your brain and you're manipulating your process so that you're able to best tackle this test. So that is the 3 keys.
This workshop is part of the Zero to Mastery Academy. You can watch the full workshop and all previously held workshops by joining the Zero to Mastery Academy. Click the link in the video description below to check it out.